Today we're going to be looking at another series of Forge heavy tanks for the Guard. This time we'll be looking at the Malcador line. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So today's video will be taking us to look at the 4 classes of Malcador tank, which is pretty much a Forge World heavier version of the Leman Russ, with some interesting and different weapon options. In the video we'll be looking through the 4 classes of Malcador tank, the Annihilator, the Heavy Tank, the Defender and the Infernus, looking over their datasheets and how they compare to their various competitors, any obvious rule synergies and buffs in game, and how I would use them on the table. In the background, the Malcador tank chassis is an ancient design still in use by the Imperial Guard, thought to predate the Leman Russ standard template construct, and being an essentially larger tank to fulfill the same battlefield role. The tanks are named after Malcador the Sigillite, who was a close advisor to the Emperor himself, the first Lord of Terror, and the Grand Master of the Assassins. Though they saw somewhat common use in the days of the Horus Heresy, they're now somewhat of an oddity and a rarity in the armories of the Imperial Guard in the 41st millennium, generally either being held in strategic reserves or reinforcing planetary defence forces that don't see all that much action. However, there are a few Forge Worlds that continue to produce Malcadors and replacement parts for them, and they're very much a favoured tank chassis employed by the Death Corps of Krieg. Various variants for the Malcador exist, including the fairly standard Malcador heavy tank, armed with its battle cannon, the Malcador Annihilator with its twin las cannons and demolisher cannon, the Defender with its multiple heavy bolters and demolisher cannon, and the biggest and most deviant variant in the Malcador Infernus, which sports the colossal Inferno gun and must tow a trailer full of fuel behind it. Let's put these guys into action then, and see what they can do on the tabletop. So let's start out with the datasheet for the Malcador heavy tank, and as always thank you to Warhammer for this excellent datasheet with the points cost. The Malcador heavy tank is armed with a battle cannon, a hull-mounted heavy bolter, and 2 heavy stubber sponsons. At this points cost, it'll cost you around about 224 points, so significantly more expensive than the standard Russ, though it does have a slightly boosted profile. The Malcador heavy tank has a movement of 10, weapon skill 6+, ballistic skill 4+, strength 7, toughness 8, a massive 18 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8 and a 3+ save, so it is significantly tougher, but I would be aware that unlike the Leman Russ, it doesn't have grinding advance, so that battle cannon will only be firing once. This is one of the single biggest problems with the Malcador line. It didn't receive this flat doubling of firepower when the Russ did, so if it was somewhat balanced before, it most certainly isn't very balanced now. In terms of options, it can replace those 2 heavy stubbers with either 2 autocannons or 2 las cannons. To be honest, I think that any of these are pretty reasonable choices. They have good synergy with a tank that wants to be sat at the back, and strapping a couple of las cannons extra to it can make good use of the decent defensive profile, as they should be safe and firing for a good few turns. It can also replace that hull-mounted heavy bolter for a las cannon or an autocannon, again very much just letting you tailor to what sort of targets you want to be fighting. You could upgrade this thing to be 257 points, and sport 3 las cannons as well as that battle cannon. It can additionally take a hunter killer missile, which for me is fairly take or leave. You're just spending 6 points to buy a little bit of extra alpha strike, but it's not the best deal in the world. And it can take a storm bolter or heavy stubber as a pintle mounted weapon as per standard, and I'd typically take one of these because they're great value. The heavy stubber would be my first pick. The main difference in terms of abilities with the standard Russes is that it has the explode special rule, and that explosion is far bigger than normal. If it does blow up, then everyone within 2d6 inches suffers d6 mortal wounds. In general, this is going to be far more damaging to your own lines than the enemy lines. This thing wants to be sitting back well screened from the enemy, as it can't shoot if it gets locked up, so generally if this explosion ever happens, it's going to be devastating your own backfield. For that reason, if you think one of these is going to be going down, absolutely keep a command point handy, as you really cannot afford for this thing to blow up in your own lines. You also have the standard smoke launchers for -1 to hit, should you not want to shoot. Overall, this thing really does have quite a lot of similarities with the standard Leman Russ. Per model, it is a lot tougher, but point for point with a standard battle cannon Russ, the standard Russ is cheaper in terms of point per durability. I'm afraid that the Malcador heavy tank just isn't in a great place at the moment, being pretty much totally eclipsed by the standard Russ for the exact same battlefield role. Never mind all of the extra synergies that you can get with Leman Russes in the Guard Codex. Let's take a look at the Malcador Annihilator next, just to say that I know that all of these have the Death Corps keyword here, but they can be taken for any other regiments. The Malcador Annihilator is equipped with a twin las cannon, a demolisher cannon, and 2 heavy stubbers, but it is more expensive at 264 points for the tank. It is in a slightly weird spot, wanting to get very close with those demolisher cannons, but also being able to engage at range with those las cannons. Again, it can replace those heavy stubbers with 2 more las cannons or 2 more autocannons, and it has the option to trade out the demolisher cannon for a las cannon or autocannons, which could give it a lot more long-range striking power. But honestly, in terms of point for point, the Demolisher Cannon is the best bang for the buck you can possibly get. Even though it's short ranged, you're basically paying 20 points for D6 las cannon shots. Whereas if you trade it out for a las cannon, you're still paying 15 points and only get 1, admittedly at longer range. For me, I would absolutely keep the Demolisher Cannon, though you could think about upgrading those heavy stubbers to las cannons or auto cannons if you fancied it. Again, it can take a hunter-killer missile, and should take either a Stormbolter or heavy stubber. This one has the exact same very big explosion as the last one, but it also gains a rule called Lumbering Advance, and this means it doesn't take any penalties to hit when it's moving and firing with that Demolisher Cannon, which is a nice little bonus, meaning that you could move this up quite quickly at 10 inches and still not suffer the heavy weapon penalty for firing the Demolisher. Again, rules-wise, it is currently a bit overpriced compared with standard Demolishers. You could take 2 Lehman Russ Demolishers for about the same points as one of these, and they'd get an average of 14 Demolisher Cannon shots, whereas this one would only get 3.5 and a couple of las cannons. It's just not stacking up incredibly well. If we take a look at the Defender now, this one's got some slightly more interesting armament. Again, it packs the excellent value Demolisher Cannon that the other one had, but it trades out all of its other weapons for a mighty 7 heavy bolters. It does make it more expensive even than the Annihilator, coming in at 276 points with the Demolisher Cannon and the heavy bolters. So you really would have quite a lot of good general purpose firepower coming out of the tank. It can swap out 2 of those heavy bolters for the autocannons or las cannon sponsons again, so there is some room for customization. And it also has the Lumbering Advance rule that the Annihilator had, meaning that it can move and shoot that Demolisher Cannon for no penalty. Finally, it does have one additional special rule, which is Defender Protocols, which means you add 1 to hit rolls for the model when firing Overwatch. Now if this thing is getting charged, then you're probably in for a bad game anyway, as if you get charged then you won't be able to fire with any of the guns next turn. Having said that, it will be able to fire pretty convincingly in Overwatch, and if you stack that with defensive gunners, then you will be hitting someone with 7 heavy bolters hitting on 4s as well as the Demolisher Cannon, so at least you will be able to do some damage in Overwatch. Nevertheless, this is a bit of a Hail Mary sort of rule, and you absolutely definitely still do not want this thing to get charged. I do quite like the lots of heavy bolters type rule, and it's something a bit different to other things, but again you might be better off doing a similar sort of thing by taking a Lehman Russ Demolisher and a Lehman Russ Polisher, having more toughness 8 wounds on the table, and getting far more shots. Finally, we come to the Flamethrower variant in the Malcador Infernus. This one's also the most expensive of the variants at 312 points, and it's equipped with that Inferno gun, and you have to choose whether it's armed with chemical fuel or flammable fuel on your army list. It also has 2 heavy stubbers. So the Inferno gun has a 16-inch range whether it's armed with chemical or flammable fuel. The chemical fuel has 2d6 shots that auto hit the target. It wounds all non-vehicles on a 2 and has an AP of -3 and damage 1. So basically this is the sort of choice that you'd want. So this is the ideal one for removing a chunk of 1 wound infantry each turn. The flammable fuel instead has a strength of 7, AP -2 and flat damage 2. So to be a fair bit less good against things like tactical marines, but far better against 2 wound infantry such as intercessors, and can actually meaningfully damage vehicles quite well as well. Out of the 2, I'd be more tempted to take the flammable fuel myself, just because if you get it in range of something, you can guarantee that you're doing decent damage to it, where the chemical fuel, if you go up against a mainly vehicles army, it's just basically going to be doing nothing all game. You can trade out the 2 heavy stubbers on the side sponsons for either autocannons, heavy bolters, heavy flamers or las cannons. The heavy flamers are interesting as they have some sort of synergy with the Inferno gun, but they do require the tank to get far closer. And just like with all of these, if you manage to lock it up in close combat, then it won't be firing next turn. I know its Overwatch is really great, but there are a ton of stratagems for shutting down Overwatch, whether that's charging from out of line of sight, using a unit that ignores Overwatch, or charging something next door to it and just piling into it to stop it firing. In terms of special rules, the main one it has is Titanic Explosion, which means it just blows up that bit easier than the other variants. When this one goes down, it blows up on a 4+, and then everyone within 2d6 inches suffers d6 mortal wounds. Now this is just incredibly likely to happen. You absolutely do not want this going up in your own lines, but if you can get it to explode in your opponent's lines, then that's very good. Basically you want to just charge this straight forward out of your own lines as quickly as possible, get that Inferno gun in range, and then actually just move closer and closer to the enemy, so if and when it does get blown up, you get to hand out all those lovely mortal wounds to everyone around it. Just like the heavy tank, I'd strongly consider keeping a command point reroll on standby for whenever this thing goes down, either to give it more chance of blowing up in your opponent's lines, or to try and stop it doing the same to your own lines, though even with a command point reroll, it will blow up a quarter of the time. When you're setting things up, you might want to keep your distance from this tank, as if it detonates turn 1, then you could just lose the game then and there. So let's talk about buffs and things for getting more out of the Malcador tanks on the battlefield. In terms of regimental traits, Cadian will be pretty decent for the heavy tank, as that really wants to just be sat at the back plinking away with its firepower all game, and it won't be inclined to move because of a Demolisher cannon. Cast chance pretty solid on the Demolisher variants, and particularly the Infernus to reroll those multi-shot weapons, and Vostroyan is pretty good on the Demolisher variants to give them a bit of extra range. You could combine the Vostroyan plus 6-inch range and the cast chance reroll number of shots via their respective traits in the custom regiments table, which we already know works pretty well on Demolisher tanks. Talon is also a pretty solid pick for these guys as well. Besides the Demolisher cannons and the big flamer that auto hits, they'll all be suffering massively whenever they move for firing their other weapons and only hitting on 5s. On big expensive tanks that's just really not helpful, so being able to move and shoot without worrying about degrading your firepower is a really solid upgrade and allow them to fire at maximal effect on the move. In terms of character buffs and things, the normal things for vehicles apply. Tech Priests can repair them, they could get extra rerolls from Harker or Yarick, and they could get rerolls to wound against a certain vehicle from a Warlord trait with Old Grudges. If you do want to double down on their reasonably respectable defensive profile, then using Astropaths for Psychic Barrier and Night Shroud is certainly good, and it could make one of these a very hard and annoying bunker to remove if the enemy feels that they need to shoot it. Finally, in terms of stratagems, they are reasonably big tanks, so a little bit more efficient on the stratagems than some. Jury-rigged repairs could be good for getting up a bracket if you're just lower than the amount of wounds that you need, and it's impacting on your ballistic skill. Defensive gunners could be great, particularly on the defender as we mentioned, and crush them could potentially be useful in close combat if you're trying to kill an enemy infantry squad that's tying you up. Relentless is also very good from that new Greater Good book to allow them to fire on top profile for a turn, and as we said with some of these massive explosions, it's well worth keeping a command point reroll on standby for when you think they're likely to go down in flames. So how would I use these guys in game then? For the heavy tank, it's pretty much the same as the standard Leman Russ. Deploy well screened at the back of your army, use any buffs that you have on it, and keep it firing to destroy the enemy. The exception being that you really want to think exactly where this one's placed, as you don't really want to be moving it, as all of its weapons will be hitting on 5s if you do. For the Defender or Annihilator, I think that either Vostroyan for extra range or Talon for moving and shooting without suffering heavy weapon penalty are both really good choices for this, as you basically need to keep the Demolisher firing as well as all of their other guns firing and not hitting on a 5. They're a bit problematic to use because unless you have Talon, they really want to be staying still for all of their other decent guns, but they really want to be moving forward quickly because of that Demolisher cannon. So anything with extra range for the Demolisher or ignoring move and shoot penalties for the heavy bolters are really good choices. These guys ideally want to be hovering just about in Demolisher range, and again as well screened as they possibly can be, as you don't want to lose all of that firepower just by them being locked up. Finally, for the Infernus, I think that this wants to be setting up at a fair distance from the rest of your army, as you don't want your opponent just to shoot it turn 1, it to go down in flames and nuke half your army in one fell swoop. Not suffering any penalties to accuracy, this guy can happily run up 10 inches per turn, hopefully get in range with the big flamer and start making enemy infantry do the Bernie dance. If it's still alive in subsequent turns, I really would be tempted to keep it right up and close to the enemy army, just so you can bathe them in mortal wounds when it is destroyed, and if it really is on its last legs, it might well even be worth charging against an enemy fighter unit, deliberately to try and get it killed, and then command reroll it to give it the best chance of exploding. 2d6 explosion range could potentially be massive, and as with any other unit that can near auto explode like this, you do have the opportunity to do far more damage to an enemy army than the vehicle could have ever done in life. So out of the various tanks, I think my favourite out of them at the moment is the Malcador Infernus. I will be honest though, I do think that the Malcador chassis is pretty overpriced at the moment. They just needed to have updated it since they rebalanced the Leman Russ multiple times, as at the moment it pretty much just flatly outcompetes them, both in terms of durability, toughness 8 wounds on the table, and also in terms of firepower, the amount of shots that you get out of it point for point. Regular Leman Russ battle tanks outperform the heavy tank. I'd rather just take Demolishers to fulfill the same role as the Annihilator or the Defender, which means that for me the Malcador Infernus is by far the most interesting, as it actually does something different that standard Leman Russes don't do, and of course that apocalyptic explosion is always something that you can potentially exploit if you do get up and close to the enemy. Having said that, while I'd argue it is the best of the Malcador chassis, I'm still not convinced it's overly competitive. I think if you do want big flamery tanks, then 3 Hellhounds might well do you better than a single Infernus. They'll give you 33 toughness 7 wounds, which most of the time will be better than 18 toughness 8 wounds, and they'll have an average of 21 strength 6 hits on the opponent, rather than a mere 7 strength 7 hits, though the extra AP and damage is somewhat helpful. For me, the Malcador line just needs a decent points cut across the whole board of them. Currently, as they stand, I could actually see them losing something like 40 points or so to make them somewhat comparable with the standard Leman Russ, or at least giving them grinding advance via an FAQ would certainly be a big step in the right direction. I guess as always with these Forge World units, we can hope that Games Workshop gives them a bit of love when they update the Forge World rulebooks as they said they're going to. I find it hard to imagine that even Games Workshop could look at these, rewrite them in a new book, and not make some drastic improvements. I guess we'll have to wait and see. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm sorry it's not the most overwhelmingly good news in terms of the Malcador tanks. The numbers just really aren't on their side at the moment. If you've enjoyed the discussion, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more. There's plenty more Imperial Guard content coming out over the next few months. If you have been enjoying the videos, then feel free to have a look at the Auspex Tactics Patreon page down in the description below. It's what allows me to keep on making videos quite this regularly, so if you are enjoying the videos regularly, then any support is greatly appreciated. As well as helping keep the videos coming, there's also some other perks, such as getting to see new videos early, voting on what sort of videos come next for the channel, and the occasional prize draw where I post out some miniatures to a Patreon. If any of that sounds interesting to you, or you'd just like to support the channel, then please take a look down in the description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.